Well, I mean, if that's what democratic socialism is, then I'm basically on board. I do think that ordinary people, middle-class people, ought to have dignity, and I think that our current systems make it hard for them to have dignity. So I agree with all of that. But the details
and
matter.
That's precisely why, Albert Einstein, Helen Keller, Norman Thomas, Eugene Debs, Martin Luther King Jr., Ella Baker, we can go on and on. They're all democratic socialists. Michael Harrington, one of the great founders of Democratic Socialism of America. I've been a member for 36 years.
I understand, but has it struck you as interesting that it's never actually worked anywhere? So the question is not what are our goals. Our goals are the same. How do we get there is the question. So what happened in Venezuela? They call that democratic socialism, but they don't have toilet paper, and it's less equal than ever.
But part of the problem is, though, brothers, that any time there's been the attempts of ordinary people to engage in self-determination, they can get crushed by external nations. Look at U.S. policies toward Venezuela has been very, very ugly. Nicaragua in the same way. We saw that in so many other instances where countries try to engage in self-determination and they either get crushed, they either get coerced, and they end up oftentimes responding to that kind of authoritarian treatment. So we've never had a chance to really pull it off. So it's only been a movement so far. It's an attempt to resist the greed at the top, the racism, the sexism, the homophobia, the various ways in which humanity is violated rather than affirmed.
So here's, just to the details quickly. The DSA of New York, which is certainly one of the biggest in the country, recently said...
And thank God for Sister Alexandria. She's my dear sister and comrade. Absolutely.
So they said that they're against borders, profits, and prisons. What would a country without prisons look like? What would you do with murderers, for example, or rapists? Where would you put them with no prisons?
Well, I mean, when they say prisons, they're talking about the kinds of prisons we have at the present. If you have sites of rehabilitation, education, ways in which transformation can take place, you and I ourselves, you're Episcopalian, I'm Baptist, we're Christians, right? We believe all human beings made not just an image of God, but they can be changed, they can be transformed when the right kind of intervention takes place. That's what people mean in the socialist movement when they talk about the elimination of the kind of prisons that are in place.
So what they really mean is better prisons.
And
maybe they should be more... Okay, so what about borders, though?
You can have isolation, you can have distance, but you don't give up on them, and most importantly, you don't view them in the vicious through the lens of being less than human, that they can bounce back, they can be better.
So if a government's obligation is to its own citizens, and you drop the borders and have no border enforcement at all, what would happen to this country? What would happen to the poor people in this country? Would their lives get better? Would they become more prosperous? No. This country would become poorer, dirtier, impossible to manage. It would be flooded with the poor of the world, and it would destroy our country instantly. So why would you say no borders?
Well, I mean, again, no, you got a variety of voices in the Democratic Socialists of America. We like a jazz orchestra. You got different perspectives and orientations. We all don't agree on one particular policy all the time. This is true in terms of Israeli occupation of Palestinians. Some are in the middle, some are much more critical, like myself. The question is, how do you keep track of the rich humanity of Mexican brothers and sisters, of those coming from Latin America, those coming from Africa, those coming from Haiti, and those coming from Europe and Asia? That's the important thing. We know the history of America, other than indigenous peoples and Africans who've been enslaved, was to open the borders, to bring folk in, to allow people to gain access. But it's not a matter of no borders at all. It's a matter of how do you ensure that their dignity is affirmed when they arrive, so that you don't end up having the kind of neo-fascist policies of the Trump administration separating these precious children from their mothers and fathers.
That's silly, as you well know. But how do you think that the descendants of Americans... But hold on. How do you think the descendants of American slaves benefit when you bring in 25 million illegal immigrants from the third world? Does that elevate poor Americans? I don't see any evidence that they get richer or happier when you bring in more poor people. You ignore their problems. That's why we don't pay any attention to their problems anymore.
My dear brother, but if we were having this discussion 100 years ago and you had millions of people coming from Jew-hating Europe, Irish-hating Britain, and Ireland, I mean, all the folk who came into the making of slices of this nation, did it not allow for the kind of coming together in which poor and working people would be able to straighten their backs up and speak with dignity? and decency about issues that affect all of us. That's the history of the nation, with the exception of the African slaves and the precious indigenous peoples. So the idea that somehow now that the immigrants are here, and a lot of the immigrants who've only been here 1 or 2 generations now become the definitive authority defining what it is to be an American. How hypocritical can you get? I've been here 9 generations coming out of enslaved people, and I can still embrace my Mexican brothers and sisters. I can embrace a whole host of others coming from around the world. But it's not just a matter of no borders. I don't believe in just no borders myself. It's a question of making sure their dignity is affirmed when they get here.
Then you got to get a hold of the DSA of New York's Twitter account, because they're saying
we got a number of voices in DSA. I love them. We believe in disagreement. We believe in disagreement. You were just talking about disagreement in terms of defending civil liberties. I believe in protecting civil liberties. Yours, mine, Page's, Bernie Sanders, Mumia Abu-Jabal's, a whole host of folk. But we have to be consistent. It can't just be right-wing.
You always lose me at the end, Cornel. Thank you so much for coming on.